This is Education and Transformation, Week 3, the second section of the lecture presentation. And here we want to talk about our society and transformation. Up till now we've talked about this transformation as an individual experience. Perhaps it's also a social experience. Perhaps also societies are actually engaged with marking and dealing with transformation constantly. Perhaps transformation is something that we talk about a lot, that we are immersed in, that we observe, that we encounter. We don't necessarily know it by the term transformation, but it's certainly what we are fascinated by, what we like to talk about. And we talk about this in our films, in our theatre, in our television, our literature. The news media is interested in it. Gossip, trivia, it's embedded in our cultural ways of knowing. Most of the films are about the journeys of various people. We follow those characters through particular sorts of conflicts, through particular scenarios. Whether it's Indiana Jones sort of discovering himself in the middle of a jungle and having to find his way out, or whether it's Bridget Jones being involved in a relationship she doesn't sort of care for or is confused by, and we follow her through that. It's a study of transitions, of ways in which people are transformed, and we're fascinated by the journeys of these characters. You know, this word journey crops up a lot. You watch the reality television, they always talk about people's journeys. What they're effectively talking about is people's change, people's transformation. People's transformation of being nervous singers to being fantastic performers, confident performers. Literature is full of it. Most novels are involved with the study of change. News media focuses upon change. It tells us about things going on in the world and how there's a conflict in the Middle East that has been through various stages and is nearing amelioration, or nearly being solved, or perhaps continuing to be a conflict. So we're involved in this, the way things develop. Our storytelling is about that. Gossip and trivia is about this. We read the new idea to see if suddenly this particular star is now fat or has had plastic surgery, or how this person has been changed, where they're divorced, or if they've got a new girlfriend or boyfriend. What's going on here? So these notions of journeys and change are all something that we are fascinated by. We observe them. So we watch others' transformation, and often we're inclined to actually measure ourselves in relation to that transformation, that we're actually involved in it. And we can sort of see these people involved in it, and we can actually understand their experience in relation to our experience, or compare ourselves to them. So our society is built around the notion of transformation. It's a very important term that's used in this regard. It's called liminality. So people talk about the liminal phase, or the limen is the term that's used. This liminality is the phase between leaving one state or condition or position of understanding and taking up another. It's perhaps that phase between adulthood and childhood. As one moves from childhood to adulthood, there's a position of uncertainty, a position of confusion. And this is sort of magnified and worked with through initiation ceremonies. They sort of honour this liminal phase. They honour this period of confusion. And in some cases, they actually exaggerate it and ritually encounter it. So this period of confusion, it's a process of unfolding, can involve isolation, it can involve retreat from sort of society, it can involve considerable self-doubt, it can involve considerable fear. And it can be an individual experience that we can go through ourselves, and it also can be a social experience. So I'm thinking, for example, of the experience of South Africa. South Africa as a nation was an apartheid nation that was governed by a minority Boer sort of leadership. And that leadership, that nation was isolated by the international community, and the international community watched it transition from a white-dominated, white-dominated society into a majority black-led society, considering that to be a major sort of experience of change. But in that process, that whole nation was isolated. That whole nation and people in that nation went through considerable doubt and considerable fear. And the result, was periods of change. So this period of liminality, this liminal phase, is a period that can be remembered because it's full of learning. We understand it afterwards better than we understood it at the time. And understanding of this period of transition can enable the person who's undergone the change or the society that's undergone the change to contribute to its enactment for the benefit of others. We often hear about the Irish and the problem that the Irish had in their dealing with the conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants, and how many people say that conflict has been resolved, and the experience of the Irish could be used to talk to the Middle Eastern nations about how some of those could live together better, and the experience of South Africa can actually be salutary for people in the Middle East and also in sort of Bosnia and in the Balkan area when there was conflict there. So there is sort of collective knowledge that can be used to benefit the changes that others go through. In the same way, you can work on an individual level, that the changes you've gone through can actually benefit others when they're going through change. And all people go through change, they go through processes of learning. So does education work with liminality, or how does education work with liminality? Well, clearly, so much of what we deal with in education is about transformation. Literature that we study in English studies, is all that studies of transformation. I mentioned this before. Some of those novels that we look at, Huckleberry Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird, Lord of the Flies, are all studies of change, all studies of the ways in which characters evolve. When we're looking at science, we're looking at understandings of change, the way, not just how, theories of science, gravity, relativity, evolution, have arisen from particular sorts of conflicted positions. People didn't understand what gravity was until the appropriate theory was developed, and it remained a contentious theory. Evolution is still contested by various people. When looking at change in science, we're looking at not just changes in the world, but the ways in which the world understands that change, what change means as a social process. In the social sciences, we're looking at change all the time. We don't look at periods of history where nothing happened. We look at periods of history where a lot happened. So the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. When we look at Australian history, we look to points of conflict that are pivotal in the ways in which Australia changed. We look at sort of, for example, the Anzac period. We look, for example, as the 70s, the Whitlam era, as powerful periods that generated change. When we're looking at economic theory, we're looking at the understandings that that lead people to understand the world differently, and the power of economic theory. Across the discipline areas, transformation is our subject matter. And we look at it in different ways from different perspectives, but this notion of transformation is contained within all these subject areas. And we look at it as students through sort of cultural stories. If we look, for example, at this sort of image, which is Peter Pan. Peter Pan is a story about transformation. And central to it is the experience of this character, Peter. And what Peter does is he refuses to change. He's the boy who doesn't grow up. Because he doesn't grow up, he lives in that world of pirates and crocodiles and red Indians, of fairies and fantasy, lives on an island surrounded by other children who've fallen out of their prams and been transported to this island without their mums or dads, and have chosen not to grow up. And along come the three other children, Wendy and Michael and John, I think it is. And they actually go away with Peter Pan and encounter that world and decide actually at one stage to go back to their homes and to continue with their lives, to grow up. And they recognise something about Peter's life and something about their own life that is transformative. They go through the transformative process of growing up. So this notion of transformation is central to that story. We've all been fascinated by, in recent years, the story of Harry Potter. And we've watched Harry Potter grow up. We've watched him go through transformations. We watched him go from this sort of very young boy into an 18-year-old boy, and we watched him along the way deal with good and evil, deal with the adult world, deal with his particular sorts of friends, particular sorts of conflicts that arise. And we've watched transformation in that boy, amongst his friends and the world around him. So this notion of transformation is central to our culture, the way we think about ourselves and the way our society thinks about itself. If you have a look at any of these sites, any of these YouTube video clips for these movies, you'll see that each of these movies are in their own way stories of transformation. If you look at this Baz Luhrmann one of Romeo and Juliet, you'll see this is an updated, contemporary version of an old story about love amongst 14, 15, 16-year-olds caught up in tribal or gang warfare. It's an old story, updated continually, because that story of transformation and conflict of young teenage children as they fall in love across forbidden boundaries is an eternal story. It keeps on coming back. Stories like The Princess Bride. It's fascinating that The Princess Bride is read to children on the verge of sleep, and it's full of those dream-type characters of giants, people with swords, of princesses, brave men with masks, bad man in white, the man in black. We watch those characters go through the things that happen at the edge of dreamland. Star Wars is a really similar sort of story. It's an archetypal story of good guys and bad guys, of fantasy, of conflict, and transformation. Mad Max is a story of the same thing. So if you have a look at these things and think about the stories that you've encountered, that you've been told, that you've told yourselves, you realise this notion of transformation is something we're very, very familiar with. So when you deal with it as a student, we're just asking you to sort of recognise this is central to your life. It's not something alien, it's not something foreign, it's not something forbidden or overwhelmingly difficult. It's very, very accessible.